Hi everyone, welcome to class. Today we will talk about understanding complex objects through simplification. Trying to represent complex objects in our artwork can seem really intimidating. We know what the end product should look like, but we might not even know where to start sometimes. So today, we'll be talking about working backward to better understand what we're seeing. Then we can identify the steps we need to move forward in creating our artwork. You can simplify almost anything into basic shapes. This means that you can also create almost anything using those same basic shapes. Just like we talked about in our previous lessons, when we start drawing simply, we can move towards complexity and save details for last. That's why there are two parts to this lesson. First, let's look at how to break down an object from complex to simple. Then we can build up our image from simple to complex in a drawing exercise. This may sound like a pretty basic premise, but there's actually going to be a lot of problem solving involved in this. Through your journey with art, you'll encounter plenty of problem-solving opportunities because there isn't a single formula for image creation. I encourage you to observe and think critically when it comes to applying this lesson to your own artwork. Now let's get started. For today's lesson, you will need a printout of this episode's worksheet, a pencil, and an eraser. First, let's talk about breaking down a complex object into simple shapes. The purpose of this is to work backward to better understand the object. The better we understand the object, the easier it will be to draw it. Let's look at some examples. When we first observe an object to draw, we look for the biggest, simplest shape or shapes that best describe the object as a whole. The simplest shape to describe this bottle would be a rectangle. Although there are multiple parts to this bottle, the rectangle captures the general shape of the bottle as a whole. It is important to break down the object in our mind to the most basic form in order to give ourselves a good base to build on the details. We will talk more about why this is important later. Here's another example. As you can see, it is a much more complex shape than the bottle. Complicated, intricate objects can be overwhelming at first glance. If you look closely, you might see that this telephone can be made up of many, many simple geometric shapes. But again, what we're looking for are the biggest, simplest shapes that best describe the entire object, not all the individual parts. Unlike with the bottle, we have to use multiple simple shapes to understand this telephone. We want to find the key shapes that simply describe the structure of the object to help us understand it and get our drawing started. In some cases, an object might not have obvious simple geometric shapes, like this plant. We would have to use organic shapes and S-curves, which can be tricky. So if you're a beginner, I recommend practicing with more geometric objects to start. But if you want a challenge, objects like this plant would be great. Remember, the purpose for breaking down the object is to help us build up our drawing. Simplification allows us to create a good base for the rest of our drawing because we can understand what we're seeing and focus on creating an accurate drawing right from the start without getting distracted by all the details. So now let's talk about building up our drawing. As a general rule of thumb, we want to build up our drawings from big and simple to small and complex. Think of the big shapes as a structure for the medium shapes, small shapes, and tiny details to be anchored to later. We're gonna practice the process of building up a drawing on our worksheet. As I said, there isn't a single formula for image creation, but here are 3 steps that will be helpful for us as we build up our drawing. Identify, place, and adjust. We'll be identifying and placing shapes in multiple rounds as we go from big and simple to small and complex, and we'll be tweaking and adjusting our shapes throughout the whole process. Let's switch over to the worksheet and I'll walk you through it. For today's drawing exercise, replicate the line drawing on the worksheet as accurately as you can as you build up from simple to complex. Feel free to draw on the reference to help you problem solve. And make sure you sharpen your pencil to keep your drawing looking neat. First, let's identify the simplest shapes. Again, at this stage, we're trying to understand this object in the simplest form to create that good structure for the medium shapes, small shapes, and tiny details to be anchored to later. These look like the simplest, biggest shapes to start our drawing with. First, draw a big circle. Draw as big as possible so that you can fit all the details in your drawing. But make sure you leave some room under the circle for the base. Notice that the base is positioned directly under the circle. To line them up properly, we're going to be using guidelines. Guidelines are temporary marks used as a guide. They help us accurately place shapes, measure angles, and determine proportions in our drawing. Our first guideline is the center line, which is the imaginary line in the center of an object. Center lines can be horizontal or vertical depending on the object. Let's draw both. We start with center lines to establish a good reference point for everything else moving forward. Draw your center lines lightly since they will be erased. Under the circle, draw half an oval to represent the base. Use the vertical center line to help you align the base with the circle. Notice that the base is wider than it is tall. Notice also that the height of the base is taller than the space between the circle and the base. Although your drawing might not be the exact same size as the reference, try to accurately reflect these proportions in your drawing. Proportion is the relationship in size between two or more things. Even though these shapes are simple, it's really important to get them right because all the other shapes and details have to fit in and around these foundational shapes. Throughout this whole process, adjust your drawing as needed. When our most important big shapes are set, we can identify the next step. Let's work on this large half circle around the main circle. But first, let's problem solve a bit to find the right placement. Notice that the curve starts and stops at these knobs. Notice also that the knobs line up with each other and the center of the circle. Try to replicate that same angle on your own drawing to determine the placement of the knobs on the circle. You can also use your pencil to measure the angle and transfer that angle to your drawing. Since we're still working simply, draw the knobs as rectangles for now, and we'll add the details later. For the half circle, we could start drawing the outer line of the curve. But again, let's work strategically and problem solve. The entire curve of the half circle is the same thickness from one end to the other. But the space between the half circle and the circle is narrower on the ends of the base of each knob and wider in the center, forming a crescent. Let's start drawing the curve closest to the circle. Make sure that the crescent is even. Figuring out the distance between the inner curve and the circle makes it easy to draw the outer curve. It runs from one knob to the other, and all you have to do is make sure that the outer curve keeps a consistent distance away from the inner curve. Now that the half circle is established, we know where to draw the part connecting the half circle and the base. Make sure that it lines up with the center line, and remember to watch out for proportions. Adjust your drawing whenever you need to. Not everyone will draw in this order, but as you can see, some parts of the drawing rely on others for accurate placement and proportions. Finding these kinds of relationships between different elements is really helpful for simplifying shapes, understanding what we're seeing, and problem solving. If your simple shapes still need work, keep on adjusting your drawing. Take your time with this. If you start too soon with the details without having the proper structure to contain them, you might have to redo them. When you're ready for the details, add them bit by bit as well. Even details can be started simply. Remember to keep looking for simple shapes and use your guidelines to keep elements aligned properly. Keep adding details and adjusting your drawing until it is finished. Again, not all drawings and not all artists will follow this exact process. Building up an image can look different from piece to piece, and it will be up to you to figure out how to tackle each one. But generally, breaking down a complex object into something simple and understandable will help us to build up our own artwork from something simple to something more complex. The process of simplification can be used to go beyond drawing single objects. When we distill an overload of information to the most basic parts, we can analyze and replicate whole images, understand more advanced concepts, and build up complex compositions made up of multiple elements. Simplification is a useful strategy, regardless of medium, style, subject matter, and level of experience. These are all things that you can explore as you continue to master identifying shapes, figuring out placements, and adjusting your images to get all the pieces to fit just right. When you have a tough time problem solving, remember that simplification is key, because oftentimes working backwards helps us to identify what steps we need to move forward. So keep drawing, keep it simple, and I'll see you in the next class.